Build a complete collection from Visnews Video. Space, the frontiers and beyond, explores the past, present and future of man's experience in space. From the launch of Sputnik over 30 years ago to the satellites and space stations of the future. Wings, the Jet Age, is a thrilling video on flight, using breathtaking sequences to trace the development of the jet aircraft from the Second World War to the sophisticated planes of today. Wings at War captures the story of military air power, how man has taken warfare to the skies, featuring many different types of military aircraft, from the Battle of the Somme to the fall of Saigon. Wheels, the Joy of Cars, will take you on a spin through 100 years of motoring pleasures. It traces the early development of some of the cars we see on the road today, explores the exhilaration of the racetrack, and features dream and vintage cars of days gone by. Motorcycling, Britain's golden years, lets you experience once again the great days of British motorcycling, when British bikes and racers led the pack. Introduced by Murray Walker, it features every aspect of the golden age of the British bike. The Music, Memories and Milestones series examines 4 unforgettable decades through original news footage and hit music of the time. Relive the 1930s through the sounds of the big bands. Follow the rise of fascism in Europe, the abdication of Edward VIII, and his marriage to Mrs. Simpson. The 1940s, 10 years that changed the world. Look back at the courage and fear of the Second World War. Hear again the stirring voice of Vera Lynn, and witness the victory and defeat of 1945. Experience the hope of good things to come, the excitement of the royal wedding of 1947. The 1950s brings you Elvis Presley, the 4-Minute Mile and the launch of Sputnik. Take a nostalgic look back at the fashions, the frills of the day, shorter skirts, Bill Haley's Rock Around the Clock, and the bikini. But also at a more serious world, as America entered the Korean War. The 1960s was the decade of the miniskirt and Carnaby Street, of Beatlemania, the Beach Boys and Chubby Checkers the Twist. Look back at the enigmatic power of Martin Luther King and John F. Kennedy, and flower power as students protested for peace, while the Vietnam War raged on. Where were you when the Queen was crowned in 1953, or when Nelson Mandela was released? These and many other headline-grabbing moments are brought together in one video, featuring original news footage and hit music. Visnews Video Collection. Programs to enjoy again and again.
Air warfare was born during the First World War. As the massive land armies maneuvered on the ground, the soldiers needed to know what was going on over the horizon. With few tall buildings available for observation posts, the armies wanted a better means of finding out about the enemy's troop movements and artillery positions. For a while, balloons were used, and then the French army discovered the aeroplane. It quickly proved itself to be the best means of reconnaissance, and this became the first task of the military airmen. A third dimension was added to warfare. Just as scouting cavalry was armed to protect itself against an enemy, so scouting planes began to carry small arms to defend themselves and to attack enemy scouts. The scout became the fighter. And by 1916, when this French aerodrome was filmed, most aircraft carried at least one light machine gun. The powerful Bristol fighter of 1917 had both a forward-firing Vickers gun aimed by the pilot, and to cover an attack from behind, a movable Lewis gun on a scarf ring mounting, aimed and fired by the observer. English single-seaters were usually armed with twin Vickers guns, synchronized to fire through the propeller. These two fighter configurations were standard for the next 20 years. At the top of the list of qualities airmen have always looked for in a scout or fighter is speed. A fighter is useless on the ground, so speed into the air is essential. Once airborne, speed of climb and the power to get above the enemy matter most. And when battle is joined, the fighter pilot wants speed to engage and speed to escape if overwhelmed. The top speed of a fighter is a matter of life or death to its pilot. During the 1920s, an international competition for seaplanes, the Schneider Trophy races, acted as a great stimulus to engine and airframe makers. Great public interest in the races spurred governments to fund development. In 1931, the trophy was won outright by a Rolls-Royce engined S-6B machine flown by an RAF fighter pilot and designed by R.J. Mitchell of Supermarine. His company invested in a monoplane fighter, much influenced by racing, and also using a Rolls-Royce race-proven engine. It first flew as the type F-37-34 in 1936 and was soon called the Spitfire. When it entered squadron service with the RAF in June 1938, the Spitfire was capable of over 360 miles an hour in level flight. 15 years later, another British fighter, powered by a Rolls-Royce jet engine, took off in an attempt to break the sound barrier. It sped over a measured course off the south coast of England to win the world airspeed record at 727 miles an hour, almost exactly twice as fast as the Spitfire. The long-dreaded sound barrier, the speed at which sound travels and beyond which many fighters of the late 40s couldn't pass without serious structural and stability problems, was over 100 miles an hour behind it. The aircraft was the Hawker Hunter. The pilot, Squadron Leader Neville Duke. To speed must be added maneuverability. To hold an enemy in one's sights long enough to fire at him while he's struggling to escape demands a superior ability to twist and turn. The Fairey Fantôme of the mid-30s had a 925 horsepower Hispano-Suiza liquid-cooled inline engine under its streamlined nose, and it was fast for a biplane. But more important, like all the strong, compact biplane fighters of its time, the Fantôme was highly maneuverable. Had this prototype not crashed at a demonstration in Belgium, the type might have been the RAF's last biplane fighter, for it was faster than the Gladiator.
The world's fastest up-to-the-minute skyfighter takes off for a demonstration of super stunting.
The newsreel, as usual, was exaggerating. The Gloucester Gauntlet was fabric-covered, although metal-framed, and could fly at about 230 miles an hour.
Now into a spin.
It carried 2 Vickers guns, just like the Sopwith Camel of 20 years earlier. 22 RAF squadrons were equipped with gauntlets, which shared the front line of Britain's air defence with the Hawker Fury until 1938.
Look what
The
ground's up
dogfights over the trenches had taught the men commanding the RAF to value manoeuvrability in fighters and aerobatic skill in pilots very highly.
to. A nosedive from 10,000 feet.
So despite the high drag of its struts and bracing wires, the biplane fighter continued to appeal to a conservative air staff, while Messerschmitt's 109 monoplane was already fighting in Spain. An Israeli Shafrir guided missile is loaded with a large explosive charge that will almost certainly destroy any aircraft it can hit. Today, the fighter's prime armament is steered electronically towards its target, and so the missile shares with the fighter the ability to maneuver. The Mirage is ready for combat. Protective cover and locks are taken off the Shafrir. The enemy's only chance of escape is to confuse the missile guidance with electronic countermeasures or take very extreme evasive action. He fails. These airmen are loading drum magazines for Lewis guns in 1918. The same weapons were still in use 20 years later. When fighters fire light .303 ball ammunition, it's important that lots of it hits the target. By the mid-1930s, it was clear that greater firepower was necessary to destroy strong all-metal aircraft in air combat. Fighters were needed capable of carrying 8 machine guns. The Hawker Hurricane was the first of them. It fired 8,000 rounds a minute, so just a 3-second burst was lethal when it hit lightly armored German bombers during the Battle of Britain. The ammunition for this Gloucester Meteor's 4 Hispano cannon is loaded in large boxes for speed of turnaround. In air defense, seconds count. The Mark 8 Meteors and the USAF's F-86 Sabres, seen here during a joint exercise in 1951 at the height of the Cold War, could not maintain long patrols at altitude, even with external fuel tanks. If they were directed badly and they missed the intruders, they soon had to return to base. So techniques of in-flight refueling were perfected to extend the range of the fast-climbing, fuel-devouring interceptor fighters. The 3 jets gradually approach the American tanker. Probes lock into drogues. The fuel is transferred. In this way, the Meteor's endurance was extended to over 3 hours. The idea was not new. It had been pioneered in the 1930s by Sir Alan Cobham.
The whole idea of refueling in the air is to take advantage of the fact that an aeroplane can fly with a far greater load than it can take off with.
Well, if we get sunshine like this all the way, we shall be a very great deal luckier than we were in our early experiments. We're just going up in the air to do a last rehearsal before the flight, and you can judge for yourselves what you think of refueling in the air.
On the 5,000-mile hop, which he plans to do in 48 hours, Sir Alan will refuel 4 times while actually flying.
fuel-carrying plane pays out a line which has the petrol pipe attached. And aboard Sir Allen's machine, the line is hauled in by Squadron Leader Helmore. Now for the petrol pipe. The two planes very skillfully keeping a constant distance apart, the airspeed courier takes in the fuel. There goes the signal to cast off the pipe. This experiment may bring India within 2 days of England. Another triumph for a great airways pioneer.
These 1951 air exercises combined the newest radars with much older techniques of fighter controlling.
There's a big raid developing in Dog George over there now, sir.
Yes, sir. Scramble all the squadrons that you've got at readiness in both sectors.
ROC, be on the lookout for 50-plus.
Alert all guns.
11 years earlier, during the Battle of Britain, radar-directed fighters proved that the complex system worked. The squadrons could be accurately positioned to meet the raids. But before radar was invented and fighter controllers could tell when enemy aircraft were approaching while they were still far away, standing air patrols formed the basis of air defense. Squadrons swept to and fro in large formations, impressive to the public, but difficult to maneuver and inefficient as a means of catching raiders. The public had been much alarmed during the Great War by the ease with which Zeppelins and Gotha bombers had roamed across London and the surrounding countryside, occasionally dropping bombs. The defences didn't seem very effective. The widespread belief that the bomber will always get through deeply affected the development of air forces in the 1930s. But even before the Great War ended, the DH-9 light bomber had been shown up as unreliable. It could not have got through, nor was it intended to bomb cities. The idea that civilians might be deliberately bombed by the RAF was, of course, still unthinkable. The Fairy Fawn equipped 5 RAF squadrons in the mid-1920s. They flew from English airfields and practiced attacking military and naval targets by day. No one could imagine who they might be used against. The only country capable of attacking Britain by air was our ally, France. So rather than admit to doing nothing, the light bomber squadrons spent much of their time training for air shows. In 1934, Lord Rothermere, the owner of the Daily Mail, ordered an executive transport from Bristol. It had many modern features and astonished everyone by its speed. Capable of 307 miles an hour, it was far faster than the RAF's best fighter in service. Rothermere offered his plane to the air staff, which ordered a bomber version at once. It was called the Blenheim, and it was briefly the fastest bomber in the world, but it was never the best.
In this bombing practice, men, the object is to sink the old steamer Mount Shasta as quickly as possible. Let's go. Careful there, men. There's 70 pounds of TNT in each of those babies.
Soldiers were well aware of the danger of bombing. Sailors took more convincing.
War freighter, now the Mount Shasta lies a floating target.
Small bombs, badly aimed, could do little damage to ships, they thought. A series of demonstrations in the United States proved how wrong they were and how easily ships could be sunk if they were hit. The aircraft could fly calmly towards the target while the bomb aimer took a steady aim. But the reality of attacking ships which fought back proved to be quite different. In the meantime, airmen learned the business of bombing with ordnance and instruments quite unfitted to the modern war that was soon to break out. The Mark 7 automatic bomb sight required pilots to maintain a perfectly steady course over the target, an almost superhuman task in action. Dead reckoning navigation was difficult, and at night, aircraft sometimes had trouble getting to within 50 miles of their targets. But then the RAF was still mainly a day bomber force. In Germany, tactical air power developed in a different direction. Close support of army operations was the Luftwaffe's primary task, and in the Junkers 87 and Heinkel 111 bombers, it had effective tactical aircraft. The Heinkel had a crew of 5, carried about 4,000 pounds of bombs, and defended itself with 6 machine guns. Two were mounted in a ventral gondola they called the deathbed. The Heinkel, the Junkers 87 and the ME 110 were all vulnerable to 8-gun fighters when employed in a strategic role against Britain, but they did great damage on the Eastern Front. The Second World War saw the development of 2 new weapons for tactical aircraft. Napalm is a jellified petroleum. Dropped in large tanks, it burns explosively like a Molotov cocktail petrol bomb. Rockets combine the ballistic qualities of a bullet with the weight of a small bomb. They're used against hard targets like tanks, trains, and concrete emplacements. Bell's AH-1 Cobra first came to Vietnam to ride shotgun beside large transport helicopters. Heavily armored against ground fire and able to place rockets, grenades and gunfire very accurately, they were effective against tanks and troop concentrations. The helicopter became a true warplane for the first time. Vietnam, like previous wars, showed up the strengths and weaknesses of all types of aircraft. In testing conditions, uncomplicated, rugged old technology was sometimes hard to beat. The Douglas Sky Raider, a piston-engined naval bomber thought obsolete in 1950, had almost been pensioned off when it was found that its great carrying power and endurance made it ideal for ground attack in Vietnam. It could carry 8,000 pounds of ordnance beneath its wings, a load 5 Stukas couldn't lift, and its theoretical range was over 3,000 miles, or nearly 12 hours in the air. It earned great glory escorting rescue patrols, softening up the ground defenses to let the helicopters in. In 1940, the de Havilland Design Office was working flat out on a light bomber. It looked reassuringly right, but rather surprisingly was made of plywood to save scarce aluminium and to increase the number of firms capable of subcontracting work. The Mosquito's 2 Merlins gave it tremendous speed, and so it needed no defensive armament. It could carry a 4,000-pound bomb as far as Berlin, and it was also a joy to fly. On this low-level sortie to Holland in 1942, the Mosquitoes are accompanied by Venturas and Bostons. The Martin B-26 Marauder first flew in the same week as the Mosquito, and most versions carried the same weight of bombs. But there the similarities end. Instead of a crew of 2, the American aircraft carried up to 7 men. 4 of them were gunners, and on this trip they're carrying a cameraman too. The narrow, highly loaded wings were designed for the best performance at speed. Inexperienced pilots found the Marauder tricky to handle near the ground, and it won a reputation as a widowmaker. Compared to the Mosquito, it was a brute. But brutes have their place in warfare too, and the Marauder could certainly pack a punch. Medium bombers flew by day to achieve the precision needed in close support of troops. The damage they could do was far from insignificant, as these pictures of Cassino after 3,000 sorties by a force of B-25 Mitchells and Bostons shows. But the power of the jet engine has transformed the medium bomber since those days. These tiny Cessna A-37s of the South Vietnamese Air Force, officially described as a light strike aircraft, can carry a greater load than the Marauder at nearly twice the speed. On April the 18th, 1942, final preparations were made for an extraordinary bombing raid. 16 B-25 Mitchells staggered off the deck of USS Hornet, each carrying 2,000 pounds of bombs and fuel for a long flight. All observers were relieved. Most were surprised, for bombers of this weight had no business on aircraft carriers. The raid on Tokyo was a one-off, designed as a coup to alarm the enemy into wasting material on air defenses and to boost morale in the USA. But it was a sign of things to come from carriers. The Royal Navy's Supermarine Walrus makes flying off a ship look easy. Just as reconnaissance had been the first task of the aeroplane over the land battlefield, so it was at sea. British battleships and cruisers in the 1930s were equipped with these sturdy amphibians, they had wheels as well, which they catapulted into the air to peer over the horizon. On their return, the crews had to be as much boatmen as airmen. "25 years later, electronics gave the admirals the data they needed about their battle environment. Aircraft like the 27-ton RA-5 Vigilante carried a bank of different types of camera and airborne radars. The slower-flying Hawkeye scanned many thousands of square miles of sea. The dish mounted above its fuselage protects its rotating radar aerial. In 1940, maritime reconnaissance was a different matter. Here is the crew of a Sunderland of RAF Coastal Command getting ready for a long-range patrol. The Sunderland was derived from the luxurious Empire flying boats of the pre-war Imperial Airways. And although it was usually terribly cold over the North Atlantic, particularly in the gun turrets or when windows had to be opened to obtain a better view, it had home comforts which smaller aircraft could not provide. Patrols could last up to 13 hours, taking the flying boat further into the Atlantic than any other type available at the beginning of the war. They inconvenienced the U-boats, which were forced to submerge when the Sunderlands approached. But they rarely sank them because the 100-pound anti-submarine bombs were ineffective. The weary crews usually brought back news of enemy movements they were powerless to prevent. Land-based aircraft like the Armstrong Whitworth-Whitley were not much more successful, although shipping was constantly attacked by bombers. These airmen knew that bombing ships was a chancy business because of the inaccuracy of their bomb sights, the feebleness of the bombs, and the ferocity of the ship's defense. In the early days of the Second World War, many British airmen were lost, and very few Axis ships were sunk in high-level bombing raids. Dive bombing was another matter. The Germans had a highly specialized aircraft. The Junkers 87 Stuka was difficult to hit with anti-aircraft fire, and it was capable of placing an 1,100-pound bomb very accurately. It could cripple a capital ship and easily sink a small merchantman. The best defense from the swooping Junkers and Dorniers for a Channel convoy was to hide in a smokescreen. To be certain of sinking the largest ships, aircraft had to hit them hard, with torpedoes. Torpedoes gave the simplest and slowest aeroplanes the power to destroy a battleship. On the 11th of November 1940, 20 Swordfish aircraft like this one were launched from HMS Illustrious, mostly armed with torpedoes. Pressing home a daring low-level attack on the Italian fleet in Taranto harbour, they covered themselves with glory. All but 2 of the biplanes and 2 men returned safely to their carriers. At a stroke, the Italian fleet was halved. The Fleet Air Arm had achieved more than the Grand Fleet had done at the Battle of Jutland, where 6,000 British sailors perished. The paramount capital ship of the Second World War was now clearly the aircraft carrier. Nowhere was Taranto studied more carefully than in Japan. Almost exactly a year later, 183 Japanese aircraft carrying torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs attacked Pearl Harbor at low level. From then until the war ended, the Japanese and American carriers and their aircraft slugged it out. In 1943, a helicopter, a Sikorsky Hoverfly, landed for the first time on a U.S. naval ship. Today, every significant warship in the world carries at least one helicopter. President Roosevelt himself had suggested to the Navy that autogyros, rotating wing aircraft with freewheeling rotors, might fly ahead of convoys looking for submarines. Unfortunately, although highly maneuverable, the autogyro couldn't carry a worthwhile payload. In this demonstration in a sports stadium in Berlin in 1938, a twin-rotor Fokker Angelus helicopter is piloted by the famous Nazi test pilot Hanne Reich. The helicopter was originally far less stable, hence the indoor tests, and it was very difficult to engineer. But in the end it could do what autogyros never could: lift great weights and hover in still air. In the 10 years after the hoverfly's first ship landing, helicopter development was rapid. In 1954, the Sikorsky Company built a machine which could carry 2 jeeps and a platoon of Marines. It was intended as an assault vehicle, ferrying men from ship to shore or inland to forward positions. In Korea with the US Army, or in Malaya with the British, the helicopter showed soldiers that it was able to reach places other aircraft cannot reach. Its characteristic chopping sound was most welcome to injured men waiting for evacuation or to patrols many miles from their bases. They were far less safe than they would have been in an aeroplane, but that didn't bother the men. The parachute was originally a safety device for balloonists. The Air Ministry thought aeroplane pilots would be tempted to abandon their machines too readily if they wore chutes, and it wasn't before 1925 that parachutes were given to all RAF crew. Until modern anti-aircraft weapons made their transports too vulnerable, a special part was played in air warfare by parachutists. Parachutes can deliver men and supplies where no aeroplane can land, and in quantities or at ranges no helicopter can carry. The soldiers' weapons of 1918 would mostly be quite familiar to a soldier today. Aeroplanes of that era seem extraordinarily old-fashioned. The machinery of air warfare has very rapidly improved, and yesterday's high technology now looks a bit comic.
The first radio class ever held in an aeroplane goes aboard to attend their school in the clouds. The plane has 5 receiving sets, and the men will take turn about.
This Vickers Victoria is flying from Cranwell in 1933.
Down on the aerodrome in the transmitting room, messages are sent aloft.
Tell me as soon as he's through. Couple made 1,400 meters. The box soon through.
While in the plane, the pupils learn the job in a highly practical way.
Is everybody receiving all right? You are. Pass me your message. Has anybody else got a message? Right, let's have a look at it. Hello, sir. I have a message here from the ground. It reads, proceed to Grimsby. Right, sir.
It's a great success. Ideas like this make Britain's Air Force the most efficient in the world.
Squadron Leader Swain has regained the altitude record for Britain. Wearing a pressure suit with oxygen breathing apparatus, he piloted this Air Force hush-hush plane 9.5 miles high. The 4-bladed prop was designed for the thin upper atmosphere, and so were the large wings. This is the takeoff.
The hush-hush plane is a Bristol 138.
Climbing 3.5 hours in wide circles, he reached the amazing height of 49,967 feet. At a great altitude, he saw the entire south coast from Margate to Land's End. Coming down, the breathing gear went wrong, forcing the pilot to slash his helmet with a knife to escape suffocation. Safely on land, squadron leader Swain heard that he had beaten the world record by 1,269 feet.
The sharp nose of the Fairey long-distance monoplane conceals an inline Napier engine. The reduced drag gave the machine a record-breaking performance on non-stop flights across the Empire. Innovative engineering was not always so obvious. Vickers' new Wellington bomber and the earlier Wellesley shared the patented geodetic structure invented by Barnes-Wallis, the strength of which later saved many war-torn aircraft. In 1938, 2 modified Wellesleys flew non-stop from Egypt to Australia, proving their very efficient engines and aerodynamics. Of all the aircraft flown by the RAF during the Second World War, the barrage balloons were the most homely. Tethered to a strong winch by a steel cable, they floated up from the parks and squares of the vulnerable cities. The balloon barrage forced enemy raiders to fly above it, where they were easier prey for the searchlights and anti-aircraft guns. These aerial minefields varied in height and position. Friendly pilots took care to have the up-to-date dispositions marked on their maps. For all their faults, and the Halifax and the Stirling had many, the 3 heavy bombers of the RAF were unequalled until the very end of the Second World War. Yet although it was strong and spacious, the short Stirling was generally unpopular with its 7-man crew. Its wingspan was limited to fit through the doors of a standard RAF hangar. This meant that the bomber could not fly higher than about 16,000 feet fully loaded, where it was vulnerable to German anti-aircraft guns and fighters. Everyone wanted to fly Lancasters. They started life as big twin to the Vulture-powered Manchester. Re-engined with the Merlin, the Lancaster took part in every major night attack on Germany. Where the Stirling dropped 41 tons of bomb for every aircraft lost and the Halifax 56, Lancasters dropped 132. Bomber Command liked the Lancaster because it carried a heavier load of bigger bombs than any other aircraft. Crews loved it because it brought more of them home.
American bombers are rolling from Henry Ford's great plant at Willow Run, just as American automobiles once rolled from assembly lines. Less than 2 years ago, this was only a dream. Now 30,000 men and women turn out B-24s around the clock. Scooters answer emergency calls. 1,300 acres is a lot of ground to cover. Women play an increasingly important role. 10,000 are here at Willow Run and doing a real job.
Consolidated Vultee's B-24 Liberator was built in enormous numbers by many factories in the USA. Over 19,000 were made between 1939 and 1945, and they served with the air forces of 15 Allied nations. It was a very complex aeroplane, and its manufacture was a triumph of American industrial expertise. From this airfield in North Africa in 1942, RAF and USAF crews fuel up for a long-range raid. The B-24 had an operational range of over 2,000 miles, a unique performance that was very useful to RAF Coastal Command, flying B-24s against U-boats in the North Atlantic. The normal crew was 10. There were 10 .5-inch machine guns and 8,000 pounds of bombs on board. With fuel for range, the aircraft would take off at 65,000 pounds, over 29 tons. On a hot airfield, that was asking a lot of its 4 Pratt & Whitney twin Wasp engines. Once she was up and running strongly, the crew could relax. A Liberator which lost power on takeoff was very unforgiving. With the bombs gone and most of the fuel burned off, the return trip should be safe and easy. The B-24 settles onto its comfortable nose-wheel undercarriage. It may be hot, but compared to Northern Europe, North Africa is the place to be. Boeing's B-17 Flying Fortress was well named. Every possible direction of attack was covered by at least one half-inch Browning. There were 13 in all. Under its fuselage, the smallest gunner in the crew curled up in the Sperry Ball turret, steering it round with foot pedals. The bomb load the Fortress carried was not heavy by British standards. The aircraft was conceived in the mid-1930s as a long-range maritime patrol bomber, and 6,000 pounds of anti-shipping bombs was considered enough. The American crews who first flew Fortresses in Europe in August 1942 faced a great ordeal. They were to bomb Germany by day, relying on the great height at which they flew and on their own guns to protect them from fighters. In its strategic bombing role in Europe, the Fortress had to make up in numbers what it lost in carrying power. The squadrons formed up into elaborate formations, carefully planned to make the most effective use of mutually supporting crossfire. While the slow bombers form up, long-range escort fighters prepare to join them. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning could only operate a short distance across the channel on its internal fuel tanks, but with external tanks, which it dropped as it used them on the way, its operational range was over 2,000 miles, allowing it to shepherd the bombers well into Germany and back. The fighter was fast, and considering its size, quite agile. As a big raid built up, much of southeast England would be covered by maneuvering American aircraft. There was quite a serious risk of collision. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was the heaviest and most powerful single-seat fighter of the Second World War, and it was built in greater numbers than any other US fighter. Its performance at high altitude was superb, and its 8 half-inch machine guns were devastating to any fighter the Germans put in its way, among them the new Me-262 twin jets. Some of the most dramatic combat footage of the war comes from the gun cameras of 8th Air Force Thunderbolts, as they hit out at the increasingly desperate German defenses. Yet, despite the defending fighters and their own guns, the Liberators and Fortresses fell in increasing numbers. In 1943, 967 planes were lost, and only a third of American crews could expect to complete their tours of bombing duty in Europe. Fortunately, the B-17 was extremely strong, and often flew home with at least one engine stopped and its propeller feathered. Those men who returned whole for the last trip of a tour were exultant. Frequently their planes were shattered, their friends torn by cannon fire, shrapnel or frostbite, their nerves tested to superhuman limits. death had few surprises for the 8th Air Force. When the dust settled in Europe, a new enemy was seen among the ruins, and there was a new air weapon to shake in his face. All post-war bombers have been developed as a means of delivering atomic or hydrogen bombs into the Soviet Union. The wartime B-29 dropped the first atom bomb on Japan, and although it was well able to carry a large load of conventional explosives, as this RAF B-29 Washington shows, no one doubted its nuclear potential. This B-36, the largest bomber in the world, could carry 86,000 pounds short distances. A truly strategic weapon, it was powered by 6 piston engines pushing on 19-foot propellers and a further 4 jet engines. 15 men worked the ship.
Hitherto probably the world's most formidable bomber, the Vickers Valiant, powered by 4 Rolls-Royce Avon turbojets.
The British aircraft industry produced 3 nuclear strategic bombers. The first was Vickers Valiant, seen here at Farnborough in 1951. Capable of flying high and fast, the Valiant's only defences were its performance and electronic countermeasures. Avro's Vulcan was the spearhead of the V-bomber force. In 1982, it dropped conventional bombs during the Falklands War, but it was designed to carry free-fall nuclear bombs, or the Blue Steel missile. The third V-bomber, the Handley Page Victor, entered service in 1958. It's still used by the RAF in a tanker role, refueling other aircraft in flight. One evening in 1967, the 6 crew members of this USAF B-52 climbed into their pressurized cabin at Andersen Air Force Base in Guam. Theirs was typical of many missions flown, each a round trip of over 5,000 miles to interrupt the flow of men and material passing into South Vietnam. The weight-lifting capacity of the B-52 was such that there was not enough room within its bomb bays for the number of bombs it could lift. 24,000 pounds were carried on 2 underwing pylons. The total weight dropped by each aircraft was a devastating 27 tons of bombs. The aircraft is of course nuclear capable, but the B-52 has never dropped a nuclear weapon in anger. This very adaptable aircraft has been modified to carry many weapon systems in its 3 decades of service. This B-52 is about to test fire a Hound Dog standoff missile. The Hound Dog was designed to carry a thermonuclear weapon further than the B-52 could safely fly, deep into the Soviet Union. The ultimate mission has never been flown. Air power has nothing more terrible to offer.